wrestling with that ideology is not something that the client wanted to wrestle with. He wanted to wrestle with the strategy and the how, not the why. And so he just recognized that, I want somebody that's already on the same page with me, that doesn't question the validity or the why behind my giving, but rather is just camping out on the most effective way to do it. And that's why they switched.
Welcome to Sterling Insights, Stand Out and Supercharge Your Assets, the go-to podcast for financial advisors aiming to grow their assets under management, stand out in a crowded market, and retain assets nearly forever. Are you advising high net worth clients who own appreciated capital assets? Do you want to help them sell without losing a quarter, a third, or even more of their hard-earned profits to capital gains taxes? Then this podcast is tailored for you. Each episode brings you the latest strategies and expert advice from leading financial advisors, seasoned attorneys, and experienced CPAs. Learn how to maximize your clients' wealth, minimize their taxes, and supercharge your advisory practice with actionable insights. Join us on Sterling Insights, Stand Out and Supercharge Your Assets, where you'll gain the knowledge and tools to set yourself apart and achieve unparalleled success in wealth management. Subscribe now and empower your practice for a brighter, more prosperous future. Welcome to this episode of Sterling Insights. I'm your host, Roger Silk. Our guest today is Darryl Lyons. Darryl is a certified financial planner, an author, and a co-founder of PAX Financial Group, a firm serving high net worth families through the lens of Judeo-Christian values. He's the author of 18 to 80 and a leader in values-based, purpose-driven financial planning. Darryl, we are very pleased to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Let's get started by telling us a little bit about how you think about purpose-driven financial planning.
Yeah, it's certainly been a journey over the last 5 or 6 years as it's been more defined. There was a time, I guess, historically in our industry, it was known as like social impact investing or social responsible investing, SRI. Interesting research done in that space. But, with the polarization of the world that we live in today, there's been a lot more interest in mainly, I don't know if it's from the advisor world or the consumer world. I think maybe from the consumer saying, I don't want to support things that are antithetical to what I hold to be, dearly valuable to me. And so how can I make sure that what I invest in is not at the same time undermining me? And so, just being thoughtful about that. There's an exclusionary piece. I want to exclude companies. There was one person I think of that his dad was never home because he gambled all the time. So he wanted to exclude, anything that was associated with gambling. And then there's the financial advice, from a financial advisor perspective, like how do you, I had somebody just the other day that their advisor didn't share their same values. And so they wanted to hire us. And so, it takes form in different ways. But I think if you could think about it from an asset management and financial advice perspective, there are some distinguishing characteristics when it comes to aligning values.
If you can, without talking about any kind of client identifying information, just kind of put some flesh on the bones of the client who recently came to you and his advisor and your client's values were not aligned. How'd that work out?
I think he had just heard me talk a lot about giving, and that was important to him. Some of it is a tax perspective, using donor advised funds to give. And sometimes we give portions of our business to nonprofits or to a donor advised fund, and you want to strategically time those gifts, but you're not ready to actually give it to the church or charity. And having those conversations sometimes is peculiar. If somebody's like, well, why would you give money away? That's silly to me. Why would you, give that much money away? In this particular case, wrestling with that ideology is not something that the client wanted to wrestle with. He wanted to wrestle with the strategy and the how, not the why. And so he just recognized that, I want somebody that's already on the same page with me, that doesn't question the validity or the why behind my giving, but rather is just camping out on the most effective way to do it. And that's why they switched.
So is that to say that the previous advisor maybe was trying to impose his values instead of the clients? Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, and I don't know that to be true, but there was a missing gap, whether it was he was trying to impose his values or just, I'm a Christian. You had mentioned that. Sometimes it just doesn't make sense. In the Judeo-Christian world, you turn the other cheek. It's better to give than receive. Some of the stuff in the Christian world just doesn't make sense than we do. And so I think maybe that advisor either was trying to superimpose his values or was just questioning the financial merits of it, which is good questions. But in that case, the client just didn't want to have to go down that path.
Right. So I'll come back to that in a minute. But in your mind, Darryl, who is like an ideal client for PAX Financial?
A lot of business owners, I think we just have a business owner culture. So we can solve a lot of problems for business owners. We have a group health division, which that's always changing with ICRA and non-traditional health insurance strategies. So that's a problem that we can solve. We do 401ks and we do succession planning. So somebody's a business owner that has maybe 20 employees, maybe 5 or 10 years out from retiring. There's a lot of good work we can do with them and solving a lot of problems.
Is that your core market? Is business owners who are maybe 5 to 10 years away from a sale?
You asked the question, but let me make sure I understand. Is the core makeup of our 1,400 households? No, I think it's, a fraction of, we have a lot of individuals, but in terms of our marketing strategies, we go after those types of clients.
And so where does that put them sort of in a income net worth bracket kind of thing?
There'll be a $10 million net worth. Income might be 250. It's probably about right.
Okay. And then you said you had 1,400 households.
We do.
How many advisors do you have?
We have 8 advisors, and then we have a guy that specializes in 401k and another guy that specializes in group health. Of the 8 advisors, two, maybe three, are just building their book. So the other five are, pretty full book. So we have more advisors than we need, but we're getting ahead of it, getting in front of that.
So is that to say that you're on an upward growth trajectory?
I would like to think so. I think most advisors see our A growth and say we all are, but I really like to look at that net asset flow ratio. That's the one I keep my eye on. And yeah, we're doing good, but I feel challenged all the time to make sure that we're moving up and to the right on that particular metric.
When you say net asset flow ratio, for people who aren't familiar with that, what is that?
Yeah, the net asset flow, so gross assets that we receive minus the assets that go out, that would be the net asset flow. That annual number that comes in relative to what we started at the beginning of the year, I'd really like that ratio to be about 12%. So I'd like to get of our exact assets going into next year, it's 800 million. I'd like to have our net asset flow be 12% of that 800 million going into
Got
next year.
it. Okay. So that's sort of like what some people might call like organic growth.
That's it. Yeah, that's it. And that's just the way we measure organic growth. It gets really squirrely when you try to say, okay, you got 8 advisors, where's that coming from and how are they getting it? What are the tactics that they can use to get there?
How long have you been doing this?
Since 1999. Well, I say that I got licensed in 99 and then I started this practice with a couple other guys in 2007.
Oh, okay. And what did you do between that 99 and
I
2007?
worked at a couple bigger firms. Getting in this industry, I didn't know, I didn't grow up with money or anything. So I ended up selling life insurance and knocking on doors and I did okay at it. I mean, I wasn't good at life insurance sales, but I was willing to see enough people because I was ambitious and, just trying to survive. So, but I learned some really good skills both in sales and then again, if you do good sales in those life insurance worlds, then you move up to management. So I learned some skills in management too. And so that's kind of where I was at from between college and starting PAX.
So starting a money management practice in 2007
I know.
must have been rather challenging the next couple of years.
Yeah, I was broke for a little while for sure. It was tough, no doubt. I mean, there's times I definitely wanted to quit, but my wife told me not to, so I listened to her.
It's usually good advice.
Yeah.
Yeah. How does the Judeo-Christian values, like, how did you decide to put that in your like short blurb of what you show the world, and how does that kind of impact how you guys approach everything?
Well, it's a really good question. It took me years to even get comfortable with that. Not that I was ashamed, but I just really took issue with people using that to capture business. I thought it was disingenuous. And, one of the Ten Commandments is not using the Lord's name in vain. And some people think of that as a cuss word. I think of it as using the Lord's name in order to garner business. That's using it in vain to me. And so I was really hesitant. The reason I started to modify that, still very sensitive to doing it. I always have to check myself. But there was one specific situation that was the catalyst, and that was a guy from the church that I went to that was stealing from other friends in the congregation because he was the Christian financial advisor. And so
Uh-huh.
he was selling them stocks or he was a fiduciary putting individual stocks in a portfolio, but in the back end, he was getting fees from these companies to place the business. And I just thought, seeing that and actually being the recipient of the clients that lost hundreds of thousands of dollars with this guy, I thought, I think it's incumbent upon me, if I have the right heart, to let the community of Christians know that I'm a resource for them. I felt comfortable doing that. And so we share that. I'd say our marketing is light because we don't want to use the Lord's name in vain. But if there is a time where we think it's important to share that message, we will, but it's not in all of our marketing materials.
Oh, it's not. Okay.
No, we're judicious about how we use it. I was just creating a business succession planning like trifold brochure, and we didn't put it in that. We just didn't think it was relevant. But if you peel back the onion and see who we are, in fact, not everyone here is a Christian. So, but one of the things that we do is if people come to us, we do honor Judeo-Christian values. So I think that's important.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So I just want to come back to the third commandment for a second because you quoted part of it. And I think in my mind, you put the exact context that I think it primarily refers to is when somebody like this guy who cloaked himself in the aura of godliness and then uses that to rip people off. And the way I see it, the rest of that commandment says, God will not forgive. And I think it's the only time in the Ten Commandments that it says that.
So those are challenging ones. So
You don't think God loves football?
no, I'm being tongue in cheek here, but he loves football. But the one that I think I have to take inventory of that all the time and check my heart to make sure that, because it is a slippery slope, I could easily go out there and tell people and probably garner business. But I do, want to make sure that I continue to, because of that follow up on that commandment is so powerful. It's one that I want to make sure that I'm doing it in the right way.
Yeah. It's especially, I think, in a modern world, it's sometimes a challenge to reconcile, certain aspects of life, not just business, but life with what we think God requires of us. Because, I mean, the modern world certainly throws a lot of challenges.
Yeah, and it can be chaotic. And the scripture says not to have a divided mind, which is really another way to say anxiety. And so I just find that, my Judeo-Christian values really give me peace and allow me to make, decisions that I think are reasonable, rational, and certainly under the umbrella of loving thy neighbor. And I think that's a good framework for me.
Tell me a little bit, please, about your book, 18 to 80. What are the keys and what should people, what if you had like one or two like takeaways from that, what would they be?
Not that it matters, but there are 4 books I've written. That was the latest ones. That's maybe the one that my minister mentioned to you. I love 18 to 80. It's one of my favorite books. And basically, it's a book that grows with you. It's the only financial book that grows with you. In other words, if you're 30 and you open it up and you go to page 30, it's going to tell you exactly what you should be thinking about, your priorities at age 30. And if you open at page 45, it'll tell you what you should be thinking about. And if you're 45 and you're worried about your 70-year-old mother, you can turn to page 70 and say, what should I be thinking about for her? And so every chapter is an age that prioritizes a money decision that should be highlighted. And this was developed over a year. When I was advisor, I actually don't work with clients anymore, but at the time I was seeing 5 people a day, and I was developing this book in real time. And so if
Cool.
I'd have somebody sitting down in front of me, I was like, okay, and I would kind of take notes. Okay, they're 45, they're dealing with this, and I would pay attention to that over the course of a year. And that's why I developed that book in such a way that I wanted it to be a really easy reference book for people to think about their money and just kind of pull it open and just read what's relevant to them.
You said you've written 3 other books. What are the other 3?
Yeah, the other one's Small Business Big Pressure. That one was my first book, just really diving into small business issues. And the next one's The Grand Money Chasm. My publisher wanted a small little mini book in the checkout stands of Barnes and Noble, so it's a real tiny book. But The
Oh,
Grand Money
cool.
Chasms was built for grandparents to teach them how to teach their grandkids about money without upsetting the parents. And then the final book, 1880, was next. But then my last book was Biblical Responsible Investing, kind of unpacking what we talked a little about.
And so the term purpose driven, that sort of makes me think of Rick Warren. Is he someone who you know or been influenced by?
No, I mean, I've read his stuff, but my influencers, if any, when I first got started, I got hooked up with Dave Ramsey out of Nashville. So I was a part of his program. And so PAX is Latin for peace because we were kind of hooked up with, he does the Financial Peace University. Did a lot of work with him over the years. And then a guy named Max Lucado, one of the churches I go to, he was the pastor there. And we actually
Oh,
had a
yeah.
national endorsement from Charlie Kirk. That was a big relationship we had. So we had some key influencers, Dan Miller, a handful of people, not Rick Warren. I say all the other ones to kind of give you context of who's
Yeah. Yeah.
influenced us.
So Max, if he's the guy I'm thinking of, he's written a bunch of books mainly about religion, not so much about
Yeah.
money. Is that right?
Yeah, he's all faith. Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
really, like he can make words dance. He's a very incredible author.
He's the pastor at your church.
Yeah, I don't go there anymore. I moved kind of on the other side of town, but my sister's actually in charge of global missions over there. And so I still kind of feel connected a little bit to Oak Hills Church
Uh-huh. And where are you based?
in San Antonio.
Uh-huh.
I live in New Braunfels, which is in between San Antonio and Austin, but our home office is in San Antonio.
Okay. And your clientele is mostly Texas, or are you guys are nationwide?
It's mostly Texas, but when we had some national endorsements, we got clients all across the country. We're a military city, so frankly, we have clients across the world that get deployed.
I'm going to come back to the values thing. So, ESG, I don't know, you probably have an opinion about it. Well, I'll just ask you if you guys have an institutional opinion about ESG as kind of promoted by Wall Street.
Yeah, I think it just needs to be done in genuine and transparent way. I woke up 5 years ago and I looked inside of an SMA, separately managed account, that the asset manager had discretion to exchange ETFs within that portfolio as long as it fit the boundaries that of the agreement, which is 60/40 portfolio. You play within those rules. I trust that you, Mr. Asset Manager out of New York, to make the ETF exchanges as you see fit. And then I wake up one day in the height of all the political turmoil and there's a bunch of ESG positions in there. And I scratch my head asking myself, was that in the best interest of my clients? And I would suggest no. At that time, I think there was a disingenuous push to use their discretion and violate their fiduciary responsibility to put ETFs in portfolios. I really think that was happening. That's where I have a problem with it. I think if somebody has a conviction and between the person's money who's investing and the asset manager agree to use the ESG screens, that's cool. But taking advantage of a fiduciary and discretionary account is wrong.
Right. And I thought that's maybe where you were going because when I look at it, and I know we have clients kind of all over the spectrum on what they think is what they want to support, and sometimes it's diametrically opposite. ESG, as promoted by Wall Street, seems to be a particular set of views, which I think skew pretty heavily left. And I mean, I think a lot of people, especially if they kind of self-consciously embrace Judeo-Christian values, probably a lot of that rubs them the wrong way.
Yeah, I think so. It's kind of squirrely there because, the fossil fuel, I think even some Christians haven't figured out what their position is there. But I would suggest there's some elements of ESG that Christians, if they kind of sat down, they might say, okay, that makes sense because Christians are really called to keep and cultivate this garden that we have called the earth. And so how can we do that in a way that makes sense? There are some alignments there, but then of course there's some of the social issues and frankly some of the maybe overreach that was the most concerning thing. I would suggest to you that, and I can't speak for the body of Christ, but there was just a lack of trust that they were doing things that were aligned with Christian values, the namely the proxy authority that they were given and how they were using that proxy authority. So in other words, even if it was an ESG fund, those funds were using their authority as shareholders to vote on, in the corporate boardroom. And those votes, we do know that they were undermining Judeo-Christian values. So I think if there was a real problem, it was probably in the proxy war, if anything.
I, almost no one thinks that the U.S. government runs a responsible fiscal house, spending every year 2 trillion more or so than it takes in. And I think you could make a pretty strong argument that lending them more money just facilitates the politicians moving to bankrupt the country.
Yeah.
And that therefore, if you actually were worried about that, you would not permit government bonds in your portfolio.
Oh, yeah, that's a great point of view. Yeah, I see where you're going. It makes sense. If you dry up the supply side, people start to think differently, right? Yeah. It's a never-ending funding source. People still buy those treasury bonds. And, I'm sure that Jay Powell calls up, and I'm making up names, Bill Gross over at PIMCO and says, "Hey, will you buy some? We need your help today." And Bill's like, "Yeah, sure." And I know Bill doesn't do that anymore, but I don't know how that machine works, but there seems to be an unlimited supply of T-bills for them to use.
Yeah, well, and it always has been going back to, I think, the first Bank of the United States, way back in times of
Yeah.
Alexander Hamilton. It's been like a crony business where the people who are connected in the name of the public good, they're making private profits for themselves.
Oh, there's some interesting history with the bank and the setup of the Federal Reserve, and there's been some great books on it. I think this is important commentary. I do have to sit back and look at history to see how we got here to be able to navigate the future. The most recent commentary in this space has been reference to what happened in 99. Are we, with the AI bubble, are we repeating 99? And I think it was the guy, Andrew Ross Sorkin, who just wrote a book called 1929. And so it's a book I haven't read yet, but referencing some of the bubble that we may be feeling right now in AI being eerily similar to what happened then. I say all that kind of rambling a little bit. I appreciate your reference in history and one that I'm always reflecting on to help me make better decisions today.
I think that there's certainly a lot at a very minimum, history teaches us what can happen. Not everything that can happen, but if it's happened once, it can happen again.
So true.
And, you sometimes wonder whether the people making the decisions don't know, talking about the people in the government and the Fed, don't know or know and are doing it anyway. Like the inflation that happened from printing all that money during COVID was 100% predictable.
Roger, sometimes I think they do know, and I hate to say this, it sounds like a, tinfoil, but one of the outcomes of that printing of the government money, which there's been some interesting studies on that, is those that had assets 5 years later won, air quotes. Those that didn't have assets lost. Those that have assets bought stuff and drove that price of all the stuff up. And so those that didn't have assets are left behind.
Mm.
That historically has always led to some type of revolution. And we can go back to Rome and see that. If there was somebody who was a student of history that wanted to create turmoil, you give a lot of assets to people and let inflation press down everyone else, and it creates just this disparity that crumbles a nation. I would hate that somebody in a high profile place intentionally did that,
Yeah.
but that's historically what has happened.
But that there is no sure way to destroy a country than to debase the currency.
Yeah.
And it's slightly better, but I'd like to believe that the motive was just short-term political gain.
I know. I don't think I'll ever know. And part of me too, honestly, I've had a business and I've been in a great business for the last 5 years. But I feel bad for my peers or my friends that maybe didn't have assets during that time and are struggling. And health insurance is almost $2,000 a month for some of these middle class families, and then they're trying to pay for college. Both spouses are working, and it's just a real tough time for a lot of people. And so my heart does go out to those families. Part of, we don't have any minimums anymore at our company. I mean, I have advisors that have to have minimums because they're just in demand. But as a company, we've decided not to put minimums up because we still want to try to find a way, even if we have some profitability issues, find a way to give people leadership in the midst of all this chaos.
So basically, if I hear what you're saying, a portion of your business is actually conducted pro bono or at a loss.
Yeah. Yes, but what I learned is that this is an equation I think that really works. We like to charge a fee for service. So meaning that if somebody wants advice, they're going to need to write a check for $900 or $1,000. We used to give that pro bono, but then people wouldn't pay attention or appreciate or implement or adopt. So when we started charging a fee, which frankly, it's not a big revenue source as you would imagine for us, but when we started charging them, then people started paying attention to it and we got actual impact. So that's how we've kind of navigated through the marketplace to help those people. They have to put some skin in the game.
That's a really fascinating observation. It totally makes sense. Darryl, we're kind of running out of time here. I want to ask you if there's something that you want to discuss, you want to have the audience know that we haven't had a chance to discuss yet.
There's so much to talk about. This is a fascinating business. I'm beyond blessed to be in it, to be able to provide leadership through money. And so I think if anything, I just want to encourage your listeners to recognize the value of the work that we do, the leadership through money and the responsibility to give back, not only with time, but also money.
And if someone wants to learn more about you, more about PAX, where would they go?
So I've got a podcast. There's a Retire in Texas podcast that I do. LinkedIn's a pretty good connection place. Find me on LinkedIn. And then, of course, PAXFinancialGroup.com.
PAXFinancialGroup.com, all one word?
Yeah, Paul Apple X-ray.
Yeah. Right, PAXFinancialGroup.com. All right, Darryl, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Enjoy the questions.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Sterling Insights. Stand out and supercharge your assets, where we provide the info you need from successful leading financial advisors, lawyers, and CPAs. Your hosts, Roger and Catherine Silk, invite you to learn more about Sterling Foundation Management by visiting sterlingfoundations.com.